Chapter 1. Ghosts of the Beach. The smell of cordite still clung to Sergeant Thomas Morrison's nostrils 3 months after D-Day, like a ghost that refused to leave. He woke every morning with the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, even though there was no wound, just the persistent memory of red sand and screams the ocean could never wash away. "Tank!" Private Jimmy Collins' hoarse voice cut through the frozen Belgian dawn. "Movement 2 clicks northeast. Could be nothing, but—" Morrison adjusted his steel helmet and blinked slowly, focusing on the present. October 1944. St. Vith. Not Omaha Beach anymore. Not the hell of June 6th. Here in the Ardennes, the war had a different rhythm. Slower, more calculating, colder. Like a snake waiting for the right moment to strike. The nickname Tank had nothing to do with armored vehicles and everything to do with Morrison's ability to absorb punishment and keep moving forward. 6'2", built like a linebacker from his high school days in Pittsburgh, with hands that could crush a man's windpipe or gently bandage a wounded soldier with equal skill. His face bore the map of 3 months of combat. A scar running from his left temple to his jaw, courtesy of German shrapnel at Omaha, and eyes that had seen too much death to ever look quite young again. "What kind of movement?" Morrison whispered, pulling out his field glasses. The morning mist clung to the valley like cigarette smoke in a cheap bar, making visibility a gamble. Collins, barely 19 and still jumping at shadows, pointed toward a cluster of bombed-out buildings that used to be the village of Heresbach. "Thought I saw a figure. Could be a civilian, could be a kraut. Hell, could be my imagination." Morrison studied the ruins through his binoculars. St. Vith and its surrounding villages had been pounded to rubble by both sides. The Germans had held it, the Americans had taken it, and now both armies were playing a deadly game of cat and mouse among the skeletal remains of what used to be home to thousands of Belgian families. "Collins, wake up Rodriguez and Patterson. Quiet like." Morrison's voice carried the weight of command, even though his official rank meant less and less as the war ground on, and good men died faster than headquarters could replace them. "We're going to take a look." Private First Class Miguel Rodriguez stirred from his foxhole, instantly alert. The Mexican-American kid from East LA had reflexes like a cat and could smell trouble from a mile away. His family had come to California looking for work in the orange groves, but Rodriguez had found his calling in the muddy fields of Europe, with a rifle in his hands and death as his constant companion. "Morning, Sarge," Rodriguez whispered, checking his M1 Garand with practiced efficiency. "Sleep well?" Morrison grunted. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when every night brought dreams of German machine guns raking across Omaha Beach, of watching his men, boys really, die screaming in the surf while he pressed forward because that was the only direction that made sense. Forward. Always forward. Private Danny Patterson emerged from behind a fallen tree trunk, his boyish face already streaked with camouflage mud. At 17, he was technically too young to be in combat, but his fake ID had gotten him past the recruiters, and now he was trapped in a man's war with a child's heart that broke a little more each day. "What's the plan, Tank?" Patterson asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of his voice. Morrison folded his field glasses and checked his Thompson submachine gun. "We check out that village. Could be nothing. Could be a German patrol. Either way, we need to know." The 4 Americans moved through the morning fog, like ghosts themselves, using bomb craters and fallen masonry for cover. The landscape around St. Vith looked like the surface of an alien planet. Nothing green, nothing alive, just grey stone and black earth and the occasional splash of rust red where blood had soaked into the ground and never washed away. As they approached Heresbach, Morrison could smell the familiar cocktail of death and destruction, cordite, rotting wood, sewage from broken pipes, and underneath it all, the sweet, sick smell of bodies that hadn't been buried properly. It was a smell that followed him everywhere now, even in his dreams. "Jesus," Collins whispered, staring at what used to be the village church. A direct hit from American artillery had split it down the middle like a broken tooth, leaving the bell tower leaning at an impossible angle. "Save the prayers for later," Morrison muttered, but his eyes were scanning the ruins systematically. Something felt wrong. Not German patrol wrong, but something else. Something... The explosion came without warning. Not a German grenade or mortar round. This was different. The ground beneath Morrison's feet simply collapsed, sending him tumbling into darkness with a mouthful of Belgian dirt and the distinct feeling that his luck had finally run out. Chapter 2. The drop. Morrison hit bottom hard, landing on his left shoulder with enough force to rattle his teeth. Pain shot through his collarbone, but nothing felt broken. Above him, he could hear his men shouting his name, their voices echoing strangely in what appeared to be some kind of underground chamber. "Tank! Tank! You okay down there?" "I'm alive!" Morrison called back, shaking dirt out of his hair and trying to get his bearings. The hole he'd fallen through was maybe 15 feet deep, with walls of dressed stone that looked far older than the ruined church above. "Looks like I found some kind of cellar or crypt. We're throwing down a rope." Rodriguez's voice carried more worry than he usually allowed himself to show. In 3 months of combat, Tank Morrison had become more than their sergeant. He was their anchor, the one constant in a world where everything else shifted like sand. Morrison pulled out his flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across his surroundings. The underground chamber was larger than he'd expected, with arched stone ceilings that spoke of medieval craftsmanship. But what caught his attention wasn't the architecture. It was the fresh wooden crates stacked against the far wall, each one stenciled with German military markings and the unmistakable eagle and swastika of the Third Reich. "Son of a bitch!" Morrison whispered, playing his flashlight over the crates. There had to be 20 or 30 of them, all identical, all sealed with metal clasps that gleamed like they'd been recently maintained. "Tank! What's down there?" Colin's voice was getting more anxious by the minute. Morrison approached the nearest crate, noting that the German stenciling included numbers and codes he didn't recognize. But there was something else. Something that made his combat-honed instincts prickle with anticipation. The crate wasn't just sitting on the stone floor. It was resting on what looked like a thick Persian rug, the kind of luxury item that had no business in a bombed-out Belgian village. He pried open the metal clasp with his combat knife, the sound echoing in the stone chamber like a gunshot. The lid lifted easily, almost eagerly, revealing contents that made Morrison forget, for just a moment, about the war raging above his head. Gold. More gold than he'd ever seen in his life. Bars of it, each one roughly the size of a brick, stamped with German eagles and dates from 1942 and 1943. But that wasn't all. Nestled between the gold bars were smaller items that caught his flashlight beam and threw it back in rainbow fragments. Diamonds, rubies, emeralds, jewelry that looked like it belonged in museums or on the necks of European royalty. Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he picked up one of the gold bars. It was heavier than he'd expected and warm to the touch despite the cold of the underground chamber. On the bottom, in small, neat letters, he could make out an inscription in German. Action Reinhardt, 1943. He didn't speak German, but something about those words made his stomach clench with unease. "Tank!" Rodriguez was shouting now, genuinely worried. "Answer me, hermano." "I'm okay," Morrison called back, but his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. He opened a second crate, then a third. More gold, more jewelry, more treasures that represented wealth beyond his comprehension. In the fourth crate, underneath layers of silk cloth, he found something that made him catch his breath. Photographs. Hundreds of them. Family portraits, wedding pictures, children's school photos, all with the same thing in common. Jewish families, their names and addresses written on the backs in neat Germanic script. Suddenly, the gold felt heavier in his hands. These weren't Nazi treasures. They were stolen treasures. Looted from families who were probably dead, melted down from wedding rings and children's toys, and sold for the Reich's war effort. Morrison closed the crate carefully, his mind racing. How much was down here? How many families had died to fill these boxes? And more importantly, what was he supposed to do about it? "The rope's coming down," Patterson called. Morrison grabbed the rope and started climbing, his shoulder protesting with every pull. As his head cleared the rim of the hole, Collins grabbed his arms and hauled him up onto solid ground. "Christ, Tank, you scared the hell out of us," Collins said, genuine relief in his voice. "What's down there? German supplies?" Morrison brushed dirt off his uniform, buying himself a moment to think. His men were looking at him expectantly, waiting for orders, waiting for him to make sense of what they'd stumbled into. But all Morrison could think about were those photographs, those faces that would never smile again. "German storage," he said finally. "Looks like they were using the old church crypts as supply dumps." It wasn't technically a lie, but it felt like one. Rodriguez was studying Morrison's face with the sharp eyes of a man who'd learned to read his sergeant's moods. "Anything valuable?" "Could be." Morrison shouldered his Thompson and looked back at the hole. "We need to secure this area first. Collins, you and Patterson do a perimeter sweep. Rodriguez, you're with me. We're going back down." Chapter 3. Dangerous Discoveries. 20 minutes later, Rodriguez was staring at the opened crates with the same expression Morrison had worn, a mixture of awe, confusion, and growing unease. "Madre de Dios," Rodriguez whispered, holding up a diamond necklace that probably cost more than his father made in 10 years of farm work. "Tank, this is a lot of money. More than a lot." Morrison was going through the crates systematically now, trying to get a sense of the full scope of what they'd discovered. "Rodriguez, can you read any German?" "Little bit. Picked up some from prisoners." Rodriguez examined one of the gold bars, squinting at the markings. "This says, Action Reinhardt. Don't know what that means." Morrison felt the pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place in his mind. He'd heard whispers, rumors passed between soldiers about what the Germans were really doing to Jewish populations in occupied territories. Stories that seemed too terrible to be true, but now... "Rodriguez, I want you to look at these photographs. Tell me what you see." Rodriguez flipped through the pictures, his expression growing darker with each image. "Jewish families, looks like. Names and addresses on the back. Tank, where did all this come from?" Before Morrison could answer, Collins' voice echoed down from above. "Company approaching from the south. Looks like 3, maybe 4 people. Can't tell if they're ours or theirs." Morrison and Rodriguez exchanged glances. Discovery was the last thing they needed right now, especially before they'd figured out what to do with their find. "Seal up those crates," Morrison ordered, already moving toward the rope. "Nobody else sees this until we know who they are." They climbed back up to ground level to find Collins and Patterson crouched behind the ruins of the church wall, weapons ready. Morrison joined them, raising his binoculars to study the approaching figures. 4 people moving carefully through the rubble of Heresbach. 3 men and a woman, all dressed in civilian clothes that had seen better days. The woman was in the lead, moving with the confident step of someone who knew the terrain. Behind her, the 3 men seemed nervous, constantly checking their surroundings. "Civilians," Patterson whispered. "Maybe," Morrison replied, but something about the woman's movements bothered him. She walked like a soldier, like someone who'd learned to stay alive in dangerous places. "Let's see what they want." As the group drew closer, Morrison could make out more details. The woman was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair pinned back severely and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She wore a man's overcoat and boots that had walked through hell, but there was something refined about her, something that spoke of education and breeding despite her current circumstances. The 3 men with her were a different story. Local farmers, Morrison guessed, pressed into service as guides or porters. They looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. The woman spotted Morrison and his men and raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or a signal to stop. She called out in accented English, "American soldiers, I wish to speak with your commander." Morrison stepped out from behind the church wall, keeping his Thompson ready but not obviously threatening. "I'm Sergeant Morrison. Who wants to know?" The woman approached slowly, her hands visible and empty. As she got closer, Morrison could see that she was probably beautiful under normal circumstances, but war had carved lines around her eyes and painted shadows under her cheekbones. "My name is Margot Dubois," she said, and Morrison caught the slight French accent. "I represent certain interests regarding German activities in this region." "What kind of interests?" Morrison asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew. Margot glanced meaningfully at the hole in the ground, then back at Morrison. "The kind that involves stolen property and dead families, Sergeant. I believe you have found something that does not belong to the German Wehrmacht." Morrison felt his stomach drop. How could she possibly know about the treasure unless— "You've been watching us," he said. Margot nodded. "My associates and I have been tracking certain German movements in this area for several weeks. We know about the cache hidden beneath this church. What we did not know was that American soldiers would discover it first." Rodriguez had his rifle trained on the three men accompanying Margot, but Morrison could see they were more scared than dangerous. Local civilians caught up in something much bigger than themselves. "And what exactly do you want?" Morrison asked. Margot's eyes hardened, and for the first time, Morrison saw the steel underneath her cultured exterior. "Justice, Sergeant Morrison. That treasure represents the life savings, family heirlooms, and final possessions of hundreds of Jewish families who were murdered by the SS. It was collected during what the Germans called Action Reinhardt, their systematic extermination program." Morrison felt the weight of those gold bars in his memory, heavier now than they had been in his hands. "And you want us to just hand it over?" "I want you to do the right thing." Before Morrison could respond, Collins hissed a warning. "Movement from the east, military vehicles coming fast." Morrison swung his binoculars toward the sound of engines and felt his blood turn to ice. 3 American jeeps, flying official flags, with a full squad of soldiers in pristine uniforms that had never seen real combat. Leading the convoy was a jeep carrying an officer Morrison recognized and instantly distrusted. Major Richard Blackwood, a staff officer who'd made his reputation by being in all the right places at all the wrong times. "Shit," Morrison muttered. Margot followed his gaze and her face went pale. "Major Blackwood, he is not a friend to our cause." "You know him?" "I know his type. There are men who fight wars, and there are men who profit from them. Which kind do you think he is?" Morrison didn't have to answer. Blackwood's jeep was already pulling up to the ruined church, and the major was stepping out with the kind of confident smile that meant trouble for everyone involved. "Sergeant Morrison!" Blackwood called out cheerfully. "Heard you boys found something interesting. Mind if we take a look?" Morrison glanced at Margot, who was studying Blackwood with the intensity of a hunter watching dangerous prey. Behind them, the hole in the ground held $157 million in stolen treasure, 3 dead families' final possessions, and enough moral complexity to destroy whatever was left of Morrison's faith in simple right and wrong. The war was about to get a lot more complicated. Chapter 4. Three-Way Dance. Major Richard Blackwood stepped out of his jeep with the swagger of a man who'd never had to dig a foxhole or watch his friends die screaming. His uniform was pressed, his boots polished, and his smile carried the kind of calculated charm that Morrison had learned to distrust on sight. "Sergeant Morrison," Blackwood said, extending a hand that Morrison pointedly ignored. "I hear congratulations are in order. Intelligence suggests you've stumbled onto something significant." "Intelligence?" Morrison's voice was flat, dangerous. "How the hell does intelligence know anything? We just found this an hour ago." Blackwood's smile never wavered, but Morrison caught the quick glance he threw toward Margot Dubois. "Word travels fast in wartime, Sergeant, especially when it involves potential enemy assets." Margot stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "There are no German assets here, Major. Only stolen property that belongs to murdered families." "Miss," Blackwood let the question hang. "Dubois. Margot Dubois." "Ah, yes." The French resistance. Blackwood's tone suggested he was discussing something mildly distasteful, like week-old fish. I'm afraid this matter falls under American military jurisdiction now. Sergeant Morrison, I'll need you and your men to secure the area while my specialists conduct a proper inventory. Morrison looked at the 6 soldiers Blackwood had brought with him. They were clean, well-fed, and carried their weapons like men who'd never had to use them in anger. Rear echelon types, the kind of soldiers who fought the war from behind typewriters and supply manifests. What kind of specialists? Morrison asked. The kind that know how to properly handle recovered enemy materials, Blackwood replied smoothly. Now, if you'd be so kind as to show us what you've found. Morrison felt the weight of decision pressing down on his shoulders like the Belgian sky before a storm. Below them, $157 million in stolen treasure waited in the darkness. Above them, 3 different groups with 3 different agendas circled each other like wolves. Rodriguez, Morrison said quietly. Take Collins and Patterson. Set up a perimeter. Nobody else gets close. Rodriguez nodded and moved off with the other 2 privates, understanding the subtext. Watch Blackwood's men, and be ready for trouble. Margot moved closer to Morrison, close enough that he could smell her perfume underneath the scent of cordite and fear that seemed to cling to everyone in this war. Sergeant, I need to speak with you privately before you make any decisions. Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of the Major, Morrison replied. But his eyes were asking a different question. Margot's glance flicked to Blackwood, then back to Morrison. Very well. Major, are you familiar with Action Reinhardt? Blackwood's carefully maintained expression slipped for just a moment, long enough for Morrison to catch it. I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to, Miss Dubois. It was the SS designation for their systematic murder of Polish Jews. Margot continued relentlessly. Between 1942 and 1943, they murdered over 1.5 million people and confiscated everything of value: gold teeth, wedding rings, family jewelry, savings accounts. That treasure down there isn't German military property, Major. It's the accumulated wealth of families who were murdered for the crime of being Jewish. Morrison watched Blackwood's face carefully. The Major was good at hiding his reactions, but not perfect. There was knowledge there, carefully concealed, but definitely present. That's a very serious accusation, Miss Dubois, Blackwood said finally. Do you have proof of these claims? The proof is in the crates. Every gold bar is stamped with Action Reinhardt markings. There are photographs of the families, documentation of the thefts, everything the SS needed to keep track of their acquisitions. Morrison felt something cold settle in his stomach. Major, did you know about this before you got here? Blackwood's pause was a fraction of a second too long. Of course not, Sergeant. How could I possibly know about something you just discovered? But Morrison had spent 3 months learning to read men's faces in combat, learning to spot the tells that meant the difference between life and death. Blackwood was lying. Then how did you know to bring specialists? Morrison asked. Standard procedure for any significant find. Bullshit. Morrison's voice cut through Blackwood's explanation like a knife. You knew what was down there before you arrived. The question is how. Margot was studying both men intently, her dark eyes missing nothing. There is something else you should know, Sergeant. Major Blackwood and I have met before. Blackwood's mask slipped completely for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. Miss Dubois, I think you're confused. Paris, 1943, Margot continued. You were part of a joint OSS resistance operation to track Nazi gold shipments until you disappeared with information about 3 major caches, including this one. The pieces clicked together in Morrison's mind with mechanical precision. You've been hunting this treasure since 1943. That's ridiculous, Blackwood started. That's why you knew to bring specialists. That's why you got here so fast. Morrison's hand moved to rest on his Thompson's grip. You've been tracking it. Blackwood straightened, and suddenly the genial staff officer was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. Sergeant, You're interfering with a classified operation that's way above your pay grade. I'm ordering you to stand down and turn over control of this site to my team. And I'm telling you to go to hell, Morrison replied evenly. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of artillery from the German lines, a constant rumble that had become the soundtrack to their war. Morrison could see his men positioned around the ruins, ready for trouble. Blackwood's soldiers were starting to look nervous, sensing the shift in atmosphere, but not understanding its source. Margot stepped between the two Americans, her voice urgent. "Gentlemen, while you argue, there are more pressing concerns. Sergeant Morrison, did you examine all the crates?" "Most of them. Why?" "Because according to my information, there should be something else down there. Something the Germans considered even more valuable than gold." Morrison felt the familiar tingle of combat intuition, the sense that he was missing something important. What kind of something? Documents. Lists of Nazi collaborators, Swiss bank account numbers, names of American and British officials who were taking German bribes. The gold was just the beginning. The real treasure is information that could destroy careers and governments. Blackwood went very still. "Miss Dubois, you're making some very serious accusations." "About you, Major?" "Yes, I am." Margot turned to Morrison. "There's a reason he wants control of this site. It's not just about the money. It's about making sure certain documents never see daylight." Morrison looked from Margot to Blackwood, weighing trust against suspicion, duty against conscience. 3 months of combat had taught him that the most dangerous enemies weren't always the ones shooting at you. "Rodriguez!" Morrison called out. "Yeah, Sarge?" "How many of Blackwood's men are carrying sidearms?" Rodriguez had been watching carefully. "All of them, but their rear echelon won't be much in a real fight." Blackwood's face darkened. "Sergeant, you're making a very serious mistake." "The only mistake I made was not shooting you the minute you showed up," Morrison replied. "Margot, how do I know you're telling the truth?" Margot reached into her coat slowly, withdrawing a leather document folder. "Because I have photographs of Major Blackwood meeting with SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Richter in Paris, 1943. They were negotiating the sale of stolen Jewish assets to American buyers." Morrison opened the folder and felt his world shift. The photographs were grainy but clear enough. Blackwood in civilian clothes, sitting across from a German officer in full SS uniform, papers spread between them on a cafe table. In the background, Morrison could make out the Eiffel Tower. "Those could be faked," Blackwood said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The documents could be, the witness testimony cannot." Margot's voice was steady, implacable. "Sergeant, Major Blackwood has been selling stolen Nazi gold to private American collectors since 1943. He uses his military position to transport it out of Europe and his connections to find buyers. This cash isn't the first he's looted. It's just the biggest." Morrison looked at the photographs again, then at Blackwood's face. The Major wasn't denying the accusations anymore, which was as good as a confession. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered. "How many people died for your profit?" "You don't understand the complexities," Blackwood began. "I understand that you're a fucking grave robber," Morrison cut him off. "I understand that while men were dying on Omaha Beach, you were making deals with the bastards who killed them." Blackwood's hand moved toward his holster, and Morrison's combat reflexes took over. The Thompson came up in one smooth motion, its muzzle stopping 6 inches from Blackwood's chest. "I wouldn't," Morrison said quietly. Around the ruined church, both groups of soldiers were suddenly very alert, weapons ready, but nobody sure who the enemy was. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. "Stand down, Sergeant," Blackwood ordered, trying to regain authority. "That's a direct order from a superior officer." "You stopped being my superior officer the minute you started working for the SS," Morrison replied. "Rodriguez, Collins, Patterson, on me." His men moved quickly, forming a protective semicircle around Morrison and Margot. Blackwood's soldiers started to raise their weapons, but Rodriguez's sharp command stopped them. "I wouldn't, hermanos. We've been killing Germans for 3 months. Killing Americans won't be any harder." Chapter 5. The Second Secret. The standoff might have lasted forever, or ended in bloodshed, but Collins chose that moment to shout a warning that changed everything. "Movement to the west. German patrol, maybe a full squad." Morrison cursed under his breath. The last thing they needed was actual enemy soldiers showing up while they were holding guns on each other. "How far out?" Morrison called. "Half a click and closing. They're moving fast." Margot grabbed Morrison's arm. "Sergeant, there's something else. The reason I came here today, it wasn't just about the gold. We have intelligence that a German recovery team is coming for the cash. They've been tracking it too." "What kind of recovery team?" Morrison demanded. "SS, the same unit that buried it here. They're led by Oberfuhrer Klaus Richter, the man in those photographs with Major Blackwood." Morrison felt the situation spinning out of control. "You're telling me that the Germans who hid this treasure are coming back for it?" "Not just any Germans," Margot said urgently. "SS Oberfuhrer Richter was in charge of Action Reinhardt. He personally oversaw the murder of over 100,000 Jews and the theft of their possessions. If he gets this treasure back, he'll use it to fund a Nazi underground after the war ends." Blackwood was backing toward his jeep, his men forming up around him. "This is your last chance, Morrison. Stand down and let professionals handle this." "The only professional I see is a professional traitor," Morrison snarled, but his attention was divided now. German soldiers approaching from one direction, corrupt Americans from another, and a French woman whose story might or might not be true, standing beside him. "Sergeant," Patterson called out, "I can see them now. Definitely German. Combat gear, moving in formation. Maybe 8 or 10 men." Morrison made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Blackwood, get your men out of here. You want to fight? You can fight the Krauts who are about to overrun this position." "I'm not leaving without that treasure," Blackwood said flatly. "Then you're going to die here," Morrison replied, "because I'm not letting you have it. And I'm not letting the Germans have it either." Margot was pulling items out of her coat. Maps, documents, what looked like explosive charges. "Sergeant, if we cannot keep the treasure from both groups, perhaps we should consider destroying it." "Destroy $157 million? Morrison stared at her. "Lady, are you insane? Better that than let it fund genocide," Margot replied grimly. "I have enough charges to bring down this entire crypt. The gold will be buried so deep it will never see daylight." Morrison looked at his men. Collins barely 20, Patterson even younger, Rodriguez with a family back in California he'd never see again if they died here. Then he looked at Blackwood, counting his profit in murdered families, and at Margot, ready to blow up a fortune to prevent greater evil. "Collins, what's the German position?" 300 meters and closing. They'll be in rifle range in 2 minutes." Morrison closed his eyes for just a moment, thinking of Omaha Beach, thinking of all the good men who'd died, so that bastards like Blackwood could get rich off their sacrifice. When he opened them again, his decision was made. "Rodriguez, take Patterson and set up defensive positions on the east side of the church. Collins, you're with me. We're going back down into that crypt." "And what about the Major?" Collins asked. Morrison looked at Blackwood with contempt. "The Major can explain to the Germans why he's carrying photographs of himself with their SS friends. Maybe they'll be more understanding than I am." "You can't leave us here to face a German patrol alone," Blackwood protested. "Watch me," Morrison replied. "You wanted the treasure so bad, you can die protecting it." He turned to Margot. "You coming?" "I have been waiting for this moment for 2 years," she replied, shouldering a pack full of explosives. "Lead the way, Sergeant." As they rappelled back down into the crypt, Morrison could hear the first exchange of gunfire beginning above. German voices shouting commands, American weapons returning fire, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Blackwood screaming orders that nobody was listening to. "Margot," Morrison said as they hit the bottom of the crypt, "please tell me you know what you're doing with those explosives." "I know exactly what I am doing," she replied, but her flashlight was already moving across the stone walls, searching for something. "The question is whether you are prepared for what we might find." "What are you talking about?" Margot's light stopped on a section of wall that looked different from the rest. Newer stone, different mortar. "Sergeant, I told you there were documents hidden with the gold. What I did not tell you is where they are hidden." She pressed against a particular stone, and Morrison heard a soft click. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a hidden chamber beyond. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered. "How did you know about that?" "Because I helped build it," Margot replied, and stepped through the hidden doorway. Morrison followed, his flashlight beam revealing a smaller chamber lined with metal filing cabinets. But these weren't German military files. They were labeled in English, French, and German, with names and dates that made Morrison's blood run cold. "Operation Bernhard," Morrison read from one file. "Vatican gold transfer, Swiss banking protocols." He looked at Margot. "What the hell is all this?" "The real treasure," Margot replied grimly. "Sergeant, the gold upstairs is worth $157 million. The information in these files is worth the future of Europe." Above them, the gunfight was intensifying. Morrison could hear grenades exploding, automatic weapons chattering, men screaming and dying, while he stood in an underground chamber full of secrets that could reshape the world. Margot opened one of the filing cabinets and pulled out a thick folder marked American Collaborators, 1943-1944. She handed it to Morrison, and he opened it with trembling hands. The first page contained a list of names, ranks, and dollar amounts. American officials who had taken German bribes, military officers who had sold information, politicians who had investments in German companies even after the war began. Morrison's flashlight beam stopped on one name, and his world tilted sideways. Major Richard Blackwood, $2.3 million in payments received, 1943-1944. Services: intelligence sharing, transport coordination, asset recovery operations. "He's been working for them for over a year," Morrison whispered. "Not working for them," Margot corrected. "Working with them. There is a difference. The Germans wanted to win the war, but they also wanted to plan for losing it. Men like Blackwood were their insurance policy, Americans who could help them hide their wealth and escape justice after the Reich fell." Morrison heard footsteps on the rope above. Someone was coming down into the main crypt. "How much time do you need to rig those explosives?" Morrison asked. 5 minutes for the main chamber, 10 minutes for this one." "You've got 3, Morrison replied, moving toward the hidden doorway. "After that, we're all going to be too dead to worry about Nazi gold." He stepped back into the main crypt just as a figure dropped down from above. Morrison raised his Thompson, then lowered it in surprise. It was Major Blackwood. His uniform torn and bloody, his face a mask of rage and desperation. "Where is it?" Blackwood demanded, pulling his sidearm. "Where's the real treasure?" "What happened to the Germans?" Morrison asked. "Dead, all of them. My men are securing the perimeter." Blackwood's eyes were wild, desperate. "But I know there's more down here than just gold. I know about the files." Morrison heard Margot working in the hidden chamber, the soft sounds of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, with high explosives. 3 minutes, she'd said. He had to buy her 3 minutes. "You killed your own countrymen," Morrison said, circling slowly, keeping Blackwood's attention focused on him. "I saved them from making the same mistake you're about to make," Blackwood replied. "Morrison, you don't understand what's at stake here. Those files contain information that could destroy the alliance between America and Britain. They could start a war between the Soviets and the Western powers before this war even ends." "Maybe that's exactly what should happen," Morrison replied. "Maybe the world should know who the real traitors are." "The world isn't ready for that kind of truth." Blackwood was almost screaming now. "Do you want to see America tear itself apart? Do you want to see Europe burn in another war before the ashes of this one have even cooled?" Morrison heard a soft click from the hidden chamber. 2 more minutes. "What I want," Morrison said quietly, is for the families who died for that gold to get justice. What I want is for bastards like you to pay for what they've done. Justice. Blackwood laughed bitterly. Morrison, half the Allied leadership took German money at some point. If those files become public, it won't just destroy careers. It will destroy the entire structure of the post-war world. Good, Morrison replied, and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed in the stone chamber like the voice of God himself. Blackwood staggered backward, looking down at the spreading red stain on his chest with something like surprise. You don't understand," Blackwood gasped, falling to his knees. "I understand enough," Morrison said, and put a second bullet in the traitor's heart. Above them he could hear shouts, footsteps, the sounds of soldiers securing the area. But down in the crypt, surrounded by stolen gold and deadly secrets, Morrison felt something like peace for the first time since Omaha Beach. "Margot," he called, "time to go." She emerged from the hidden chamber, her pack noticeably lighter. "It is done. We have perhaps 90 seconds before this entire structure comes down." Morrison looked one last time at the crates of gold, at the photographs of murdered families, at Major Blackwood's corpse sprawled among the treasure he'd killed for. "Will it be enough?" he asked. "The explosion." "The main chamber will collapse completely," Margot replied, already moving toward the rope. "The gold will be buried under tons of stone. The hidden chamber, that will survive. Someone will find those files someday, when the world is ready for the truth." They climbed the rope, with 90 seconds to live, emerging into a Belgian morning that looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, except for the German bodies scattered around the ruined church and the American soldiers who were now looking at Morrison with something like awe. 60 seconds, Margot said quietly. Morrison gathered his men with quick hand signals, leading them away from the church at a dead run. Behind them, he could hear Blackwood soldiers shouting questions, trying to understand what had happened to their commanding officer. 30 seconds, Margot called. They were 100 meters away when the earth opened up and swallowed the past. The explosion wasn't loud. It was deep, fundamental, like the voice of the earth itself expressing anger. The ground shook. The ruined church collapsed completely, and $157 million in stolen Nazi gold disappeared forever beneath tons of Belgian stone. Morrison watched the dust settle and felt something inside his chest unclench for the first time in months. It wasn't justice, exactly, and it wasn't revenge, but it was something. It was a choice made on the right side of history, even if nobody would ever know about it. "What happens now?" Collins asked, staring at the smoking ruins. Morrison looked at Margot, who was watching the destruction with tears in her eyes. "Now we finish the war," Morrison said quietly, "and we try to live with what we've learned." But even as he spoke, Morrison knew that the story was far from over, because somewhere in those ruins, protected by stone and time, a cache of documents waited to reshape the world. And somewhere in the approaching winter, men who knew about those documents would come looking for them. Chapter 6. Ghosts and Consequences. The smoke was still rising from the collapsed church when Colonel James Reaper Mitchell arrived with a convoy that looked like it could invade a small country. Morrison watched through his field glasses as 12 vehicles rolled into what used to be Heresbach, jeeps, trucks, and a command vehicle bristling with radio antennas. "Shit just got real," Rodriguez muttered, counting the soldiers pouring out of the vehicles. "That's got to be 2 full platoons." Morrison lowered his binoculars and looked at Margot, who had gone very pale. "Friend of yours?" "Colonel Mitchell commands the 28th Infantry Division's Special Operations Unit," Margot replied quietly. "They handle sensitive situations." "What kind of sensitive situations?" "The kind that never make it into official reports." Morrison felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach, the same feeling he'd had just before the first wave hit Omaha Beach. "How long before they figure out what happened here?" "They already know," Margot said, pointing toward the command vehicle. "Look." Through his binoculars, Morrison could see Colonel Mitchell standing over the smoking ruins, talking into a radio handset. Even at this distance, Morrison could tell the man was furious. Collins crawled up beside them, his young face tight with worry. "Sarge, Blackwood's men are talking to Mitchell's people. They're pointing in our direction." Morrison cursed under his breath. Blackwood's surviving soldiers had seen them enter the crypt, had seen them emerge just before the explosion. It wouldn't take a genius to connect the dots. "We need to move," Morrison said, but Margot grabbed his arm. "Sergeant, there is something I must tell you before we run, something about who I really am. Lady, unless you're about to tell me you're General Eisenhower in disguise, it can wait until we're not about to be shot for treason. I am Klaus Richter's daughter." The words hit Morrison like a physical blow. He stared at Margot, searching her face for some sign that she was joking, but her dark eyes were deadly serious. "The SS officer in the photographs?" Morrison's voice was barely a whisper. "The one who ran the murder program?" "My father, yes." Margot's accent seemed thicker now, tinged with something that might have been shame or rage or both. "SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Richter, architect of Action Reinhardt, murderer of over 100,000 innocent people." Rodriguez was staring at her like she'd just announced she was the devil himself. "Jesus Christ, Margot. You're telling us you're the daughter of a Nazi war criminal?" "I am telling you that I have spent the last 3 years of my life hunting my father and trying to undo the evil he has done." Margot's voice was steady, but Morrison could see her hands shaking. "Everything I told you about the treasure, about Major Blackwood, about the hidden documents, all of it is true. But I did not learn it from resistance intelligence." "You learned it from family dinner conversations," Morrison said flatly. "I learned it by reading his private papers when I was 16 years old." Margot pulled out a cigarette with trembling fingers. "Do you know what it is like to discover that your father, the man who taught you to ride horses, who read you bedtime stories, who tucked you in at night, is a monster?" Morrison found himself thinking of his own father, a steel worker in Pittsburgh who'd never hurt anyone stronger than himself. "Why should we believe you?" "Because I have been trying to kill him for 3 years," Margot replied simply. "Because every night I dream about the families whose photographs are buried under that church. Because I know where he is hiding, and I know what he is planning to do with that treasure if he ever recovers it." Collins was watching the approaching soldiers through his rifle scope. "Hate to interrupt, but we've got about 5 minutes before Mitchell's boys are close enough to surround us." Morrison made a decision that surprised him. "We run, together. You can explain the rest when we're not about to be court-martialed." "Where do we run to?" Patterson asked. "We're in the middle of occupied Belgium with half the US Army looking for us." Margot was already moving, shouldering her pack with practiced efficiency. "I know a place. My father maintained safe houses throughout this region. One of them is empty. I made sure of that personally." "What happened to whoever was using it?" Rodriguez asked. Margot's smile was cold as winter morning. "They will not be needing it anymore." Chapter 7. The Safe House. The abandoned farmhouse sat in a valley 5 kilometers southwest of Saint-Vith, hidden among bare trees that looked like skeleton hands against the grey sky. Morrison approached it carefully, Thompson ready, every combat instinct screaming that this was exactly the kind of place where ambushes happened. "It looks empty," Collins whispered. "It is supposed to look empty," Margot replied, leading them toward what appeared to be a root cellar behind the main house. "The real entrance is here." She pulled aside a camouflaged wooden panel, revealing steps that descended into darkness. Morrison played his flashlight down the stairway, illuminating a narrow tunnel that seemed to stretch on forever. "German engineering," Margot explained. "My father believed in being prepared for every possibility." Uditen, the tunnel opened into an underground complex that was part bunker, part command center, part luxury apartment. Electric lights powered by a diesel generator, radio equipment, maps covering every wall, and enough supplies to last for months. "Jesus!" Rodriguez whistled, examining a rack of German weapons. "Your old man really knew how to live underground." "He knew how to survive," Margot corrected. "The question is, whether we can do the same. Morrison was studying the maps, noting the red pins marking locations throughout Belgium, France, and Germany. What are these? Safe houses, supply depots, extraction routes? Margot joined him at the map table. Sergeant, what I'm about to tell you will sound insane, but I need you to understand what we are really fighting. Try me. Margot took a deep breath. My father is not just hiding from Allied forces. He is building something. A network of former SS officers, Nazi sympathizers, and corrupt Allied officials like Major Blackwood. They call it Operation Valkyrie Red. Morrison felt the pieces clicking together in his mind. The documents in the hidden chamber. Those documents contain the names of every collaborator, every bribed official, every politician and general who took German money. My father plans to use that information as leverage. Blackmail on a scale never before attempted. Blackmail for what? To rebuild the Reich. Not in Germany, that is finished, but in South America, in the Middle East, anywhere that Nazi ideology can take root and grow again. Margot moved to another map, this one showing South America with shipping routes marked in red ink. The gold you buried today was just operating capital. The real wealth is in Swiss bank accounts, shell corporations, investments hidden across 3 continents. Patterson was staring at radio equipment that looked more advanced than anything Morrison had seen in the regular army. How much money are we talking about? Enough to buy governments, Margot replied grimly. Enough to start wars. Enough to ensure that everything we died for on D-Day becomes meaningless. Morrison sat down heavily in a German officer's chair, feeling the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on him. 3 months ago, his biggest worry was keeping his men alive long enough to see the next day. Now he was sitting in a Nazi bunker, listening to the daughter of an SS war criminal explain how the world might end up right back where it started. "Why should we trust you?" Morrison asked finally. "For all we know, this is exactly what your father wanted. American soldiers stumbling into his web." Margot walked to a filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder. She handed it to Morrison without a word. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Klaus Richter in SS uniform smiling beside trainloads of deportees. Klaus Richter at execution sites, pointing and laughing while bodies burned in ditches. Klaus Richter in his office surrounded by gold teeth and wedding rings and children's toys. "I have been documenting my father's crimes for 3 years, Margot said quietly. "Every photograph, every document, every witness testimony I could find. When this war ends, I intend to make sure he hangs for what he has done." Morrison studied her face, looking for deception, for manipulation, for any sign that this was an elaborate trap. All he saw was pain so deep it might have been carved into her bones. "There's something else," Morrison said slowly. "Something you haven't told us yet." Margot nodded. "My father knows I betrayed him. He has been hunting me almost as long as I have been hunting him. That explosion today, he will know it was my work. He will come for me now, and he will bring everything he has." "How much is everything?" Rodriguez asked. "A full SS battalion that was supposed to die in the retreat from France. Except they didn't die. They went underground, literally underground, in bunkers like this one, waiting for orders." Morrison felt the walls of the safe house pressing in around him. "How many men?" "Perhaps 500. All veterans, all fanatics, all loyal to my father personally." Margot moved to the radio equipment. "They have been living like ghosts for months, surviving on stolen supplies and absolute belief that the Reich will rise again." Collins looked like he was about to be sick. 500 SS troops against the 4 of us? "Against the 4 of us and whatever Allied forces we can convince to help us," Morrison corrected. "Assuming we can convince anyone that we're not the traitors." The radio crackled to life suddenly, filling the bunker with static and distant voices. Margot moved to the controls with practiced ease, tuning through frequencies until she found what she was looking for. "Mitchell to all units. Suspects are armed and extremely dangerous. Do not attempt capture. Shoot on sight." Morrison's blood went cold. "They're not trying to arrest us. They're trying to kill us. Colonel Mitchell." Has his own reasons for wanting those documents to remain buried, Margot said grimly. I suspect his name appears in my father's files as well. Rodriguez was checking his rifle, counting ammunition. So let me get this straight. We've got a full SS battalion hunting us from one direction and a corrupt American colonel hunting us from another direction. And we're sitting in an underground bunker that probably shows up on every German map in Europe. That is an accurate summary, yes. And our mission is what exactly? Save the world from Nazi resurrection while keeping ourselves alive long enough to see tomorrow. Morrison looked around the bunker, at his 3 exhausted soldiers, at Margot with her burden of family shame, at maps showing the scope of a conspiracy that stretched across continents. 3 months ago, he'd been a simple infantry sergeant whose biggest concern was keeping his squad alive. Now he was apparently all that stood between the world and the Fourth Reich. Our mission, Morrison said quietly, is to finish what we started at that church. We destroyed the gold, but the documents are still out there. And as long as those documents exist, every corrupt bastard from here to Washington is going to want us dead. He stood up, decision crystallizing in his mind like ice in a winter stream. Margot, you said your father is coming. When? Soon. Perhaps tomorrow. Perhaps sooner. He has been moving his forces into position for weeks, waiting for the right moment to recover the treasure. And he doesn't know the gold is destroyed? Not yet, but he will learn quickly enough. Morrison moved to the weapons rack, selecting a German STG-44 assault rifle, better range and firepower than his Thompson. Then we have maybe 12 hours before this place becomes a death trap. What are you thinking, Tank? Rodriguez asked. Morrison studied the maps, tracing routes and calculating distances. I'm thinking we stop running and start fighting. Your father wants those documents? Fine, we'll give him a chance to come get them. Sergeant, you cannot be serious, Margot protested. 500 SS troops against every American unit within 50 kilometers, if we play this right. Morrison's finger traced a circle on the map. Look at these positions. Your father's forces are spread out trying to cover multiple cache sites, but if he thinks we have the documents, he will concentrate everything here, Margot finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. And when he does, we'll have him exactly where we want him. Morrison looked at his men, seeing fear and determination in equal measure. Gentlemen, we're about to do something incredibly stupid. What's that, Sarge? Collins asked. We're going to start World War III, Morrison replied, but we're going to finish it on our terms. Chapter 8. The Gambit. The radio message went out on 3 frequencies simultaneously, broadcast in clear German with no attempt at encryption. Margot spoke the words while Morrison held a gun to her head. Theater for anyone who might be listening. Klaus Richter, this is your daughter. I have the Action Reinhardt documents. I have the collaborator files. I have everything you buried in that church, and I am prepared to trade it for safe passage out of Europe. She paused, letting the words sink in across the airwaves. Meet me at the old monastery of Saint-Hadelin, 15 kilometers northeast of St. Vite. Come alone, or come with an army. It makes no difference to me. But come before sunrise, or I start transmitting names and bank account numbers to every Allied radio station in Europe. The transmission ended, and the bunker fell silent except for the hum of the generator. Think he bought it? Collins asked. He will come, Margot said with certainty. He cannot afford not to. Those documents represent his entire life's work, his insurance policy for the future. Without them, he is just another war criminal hiding in the ruins. Morrison was already moving, gathering equipment and weapons. Rodriguez, you and Patterson are going to take positions in the monastery ruins. High ground, good fields of fire, plenty of cover. What about you and Collins? We're going to be the bait, and Margot. Morrison looked at the Frenchwoman. You're going to help us catch your father. Sergeant, you do not understand what you are asking. My father is not just a war criminal. He is brilliant, paranoid, and absolutely ruthless. He will not walk into an obvious trap. He will if the bait is good enough. Morrison held up a document folder he'd taken from the bunker's files. These are photocopies of the collaboration documents, aren't they? How did you... Because your father was too smart to keep only one copy of his insurance policy. He made duplicates and hid them in multiple locations. Morrison's smile was grim. Which means we actually do have what he wants. Margot stared at the folder, then at Morrison. You are either very clever or very insane. Both, probably. But here's what's going to happen. We're going to that monastery, and we're going to wait for your father. When he shows up with his SS battalion, we're going to be ready for him. Ready how? 4 soldiers against 500? Morrison moved to the radio equipment. Because we're not going to be alone. Collins, remember those radio frequencies we've been monitoring? The ones Mitchell has been using to coordinate the search for us? Yeah, Sarge. Time to let Colonel Mitchell know exactly where he can find us. And time to let him know that we have information about who killed Major Blackwood and why. Morrison began transmitting, his voice clear and steady. Colonel Mitchell, this is Sergeant Thomas Morrison, 1st Infantry Division. I have information regarding the death of Major Blackwood and the location of enemy forces planning an attack on Allied positions. Monastery of St. Hadelin, 15 kilometers northeast of St. Vith. Come alone if you want the truth, or bring an army if you want a fight. Your choice. He clicked off the radio and looked around the bunker. Gentlemen, we've just invited both sides to the same party. This is either going to end the war early or end us early. What if they both show up at the same time? Patterson asked. Then we let them fight each other while we grab the documents and disappear, Morrison replied. Sometimes the best strategy is to let your enemies destroy each other. Margot was studying Morrison with new interest. You are not the simple soldier you pretend to be. 3 months of combat changes a man, Morrison replied. You learn to think like the enemy, or you die thinking like a victim. They gathered their equipment and prepared to leave the bunker, each man checking weapons and ammunition with the methodical care of soldiers who knew they might not see another sunrise. One more thing, Morrison said, as they prepared to climb back up to the surface. No matter what happens at that monastery, no matter who lives or dies, those documents have to be destroyed. We can't let them fall into anyone's hands, not your father's, not Mitchell's, not even our own. Agreed, Margot said quietly. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep. They climbed out of the underground bunker into a Belgian night that was cold and clear, with stars visible between patches of cloud. In the distance, Morrison could hear the rumble of artillery from the German lines, the constant percussion that had become the soundtrack to their war. But tonight would be different. Tonight, the war would come to them. As they moved through the darkness toward the ruined monastery, Morrison found himself thinking about Omaha Beach again, about the boys who had died in the surf while he pressed forward, because forward was the only direction that made sense. Tomorrow, there would be no beach to storm, no hill to take, no strategic objective to secure. Tomorrow, there would only be the truth, and the price of keeping it or revealing it. Morrison had made his choice back in that church crypt when he put 2 bullets in Major Blackwood's heart. Now all that remained was to see it through to the end, whatever that end might be. Behind them, the bunker's lights went dark as the generator ran out of fuel. Ahead of them, the monastery ruins waited like broken teeth against the starlit sky, and somewhere in the darkness, 500 SS fanatics and an unknown number of American soldiers were converging on the same point, drawn by the promise of documents that could reshape the world. Chapter 9. The Monastery of Ghosts. The monastery of St. Hadelin had been beautiful once. Built in the 12th century, it had stood for 800 years as a testament to faith and permanence. Now, after 3 months of artillery bombardment from both sides, it looked like God himself had taken a sledgehammer to paradise. Morrison crouched behind a fallen stone pillar, studying the ruins through his field glasses in the pre-dawn darkness. The main chapel was gone, reduced to rubble and twisted metal. The bell tower leaned at an impossible angle, held up only by luck and stubbornness. But the outer walls remained mostly intact, creating a natural fortress with multiple levels and excellent fields of fire. Perfect place for a last stand, Collins whispered, settling in beside Morrison with his rifle. Or a perfect place to die, Morrison replied, but he was already identifying defensive positions and escape routes with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned warfare in the hardest school possible. Rodriguez and Patterson had taken positions in what remained of the bell tower, high enough to see for kilometers in every direction. Their voices came through on the radio in careful whispers. "Tower to ground. We've got movement from 3 directions. Looks like everyone got your invitation, Sarge." Morrison keyed his radio. "Talk to me, Rodriguez. What do you see?" "American convoy from the southwest. Maybe 2 companies moving fast. German forces from the north and east. Can't get an accurate count, but it's a lot. They're staying in the tree line. Professional-like." Morrison felt his stomach clench. He'd gambled that the 2 forces would arrive separately, giving him a chance to play them against each other. Instead, they were converging simultaneously, like the jaws of a trap closing around his small team. "Margot," Morrison whispered, "how long before your father gets here?" She was pressed against the wall beside him, clutching the document folder like a lifeline. In the grey light before dawn, she looked younger than her 30 years. And Morrison could see the frightened girl underneath the hardened resistance fighter. "He will not come first," she replied quietly. "He will wait. Let the Americans and his advance forces test your defenses. Then he will appear when he thinks victory is certain." "Cowardly bastard." "Smart bastard," Margot corrected. "My father has survived 3 years of war by never taking unnecessary risks. He will sacrifice every one of his men before he puts himself in danger." Morrison studied the approaching forces through his binoculars, calculating odds and options. Mitchell's American troops were advancing in textbook formation, professional, disciplined, overwhelming. The German forces were harder to spot, but Morrison caught glimpses of movement that spoke of elite training and extensive combat experience. "Collins, how much ammunition do we have?" "Maybe 300 rounds between all of us, plus whatever German weapons we picked up from the bunker." 300 rounds against several hundred soldiers. Morrison had faced worse odds on Omaha Beach, but then he'd had the entire U.S. Army behind him. Here he had 3 exhausted men, a French resistance fighter with daddy issues, and a folder full of documents that half the world wanted to steal and the other half wanted to destroy. "Tower to ground." Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio, tense with urgency. "American lead elements are within 500 meters. They're setting up mortars." Morrison cursed under his breath. Mitchell wasn't taking any chances. He was going to shell the monastery into powder rather than risk a fair fight. "All units, fall back to the chapel ruins," Morrison ordered. "Find hard cover and prepare for incoming." They moved quickly through the monastery grounds, using broken walls and fallen stones for concealment. Morrison had chosen the chapel ruins as his command post because the thick stone walls would provide some protection from mortar fire, and the multiple entrances would give them options if they needed to escape quickly. The first mortar rounds landed with tremendous crashes that shook dust from the ancient stones and filled the air with the scent of cordite and pulverized limestone. Morrison pressed himself against a pillar that had probably supported prayers for centuries, listening to shrapnel whistle overhead and trying not to think about how quickly his situation was deteriorating. "This is Colonel Mitchell!" The voice boomed across the monastery grounds through an electric megaphone. "Sergeant Morrison, you are surrounded and outgunned. Surrender the documents and your personnel immediately." Morrison looked at Margot, who was clutching the document folder with white knuckles. "What do you think? Should we trust him?" Her laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Colonel Mitchell's name appears 17 times in my father's collaboration files. He has taken over $2 million in German bribes since 1943. Trust him? I would sooner trust a viper." "Sergeant Morrison!" Mitchell's voice echoed again. "You have 60 seconds to comply, or we will consider you enemy combatants." Morrison keyed his radio. Rodriguez, Patterson, what's the German situation? Still holding back in the tree line. They're watching the Americans set up, waiting for something. Morrison understood. The SS forces were letting Mitchell's troops do the dangerous work of assaulting the monastery. Once the Americans had taken casualties and revealed their positions, the Germans would strike. "Margot," Morrison said quietly, "it's time to call your father." She nodded and moved to the portable radio they'd brought from the bunker. Her voice carried clearly across the battlefield as she switched to the German frequency. "Klaus Richter, this is your daughter. The Americans are here, just as you planned. They want the documents, and they are willing to kill for them. Come and take what belongs to you, if you have the courage." The response came immediately, a cultured voice speaking German with absolute authority. Even though Morrison couldn't understand the words, he could hear the cold intelligence behind them. "What did he say?" Morrison asked. "He said the Americans can die for him, and then he will collect both the documents and their weapons." Margot's face was pale, but determined. "He is moving his forces into position now." The mortar bombardment intensified, and Morrison heard the distinctive whistle of incoming shells that meant Mitchell was getting serious about ending this standoff. He pressed himself deeper into cover as explosions walked across the monastery grounds, each one closer than the last. "Tower to ground!" Rodriguez's voice was barely audible over the bombardment. "German forces are moving! Looks like a full assault formation!" Morrison risked a look over his stone barricade and saw them. Figures in grey uniforms emerging from the forest like wolves, moving in perfect coordination despite the mortar fire falling around them. These weren't regular Wehrmacht troops. These were SS, and they moved with the confidence of men who'd spent years learning to kill efficiently. "Jesus Christ," Collins whispered, staring through his rifle scope. "There's got to be 300 of them. And they're heading straight for the Americans," Morrison observed, watching the German advance. "Margot, your father's timing is perfect." She was listening to her father's voice on the radio, her face growing darker with each word. "He says the Americans have served their purpose. Now they will die, and he will claim his property." The first clash came at the monastery's outer wall, where Mitchell's advance squad met the leading edge of the SS assault. The sound of automatic weapons fire filled the dawn air, punctuated by the deeper boom of grenades and the screams of wounded men. Morrison found himself in the surreal position of watching two enemy forces destroy each other while he crouched in the middle of their battlefield, holding the prize they were both dying to claim. "This is our chance," Morrison told his team over the radio. "While they're busy killing each other, we slip out the back and—" "Sergeant Morrison!" The voice came from directly behind them, calm and cultured and speaking perfect English. Morrison spun around to find himself facing a tall man in an immaculate SS uniform, flanked by 6 soldiers who had somehow infiltrated the monastery without triggering any of Morrison's carefully placed sensors. The man was perhaps 50 years old, with silver hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Klaus Richter, I presume," Morrison said, not lowering his weapon. "Indeed. And you must be the American sergeant who has caused me such inconvenience." Richter's English carried only the faintest trace of accent. "Where is my daughter?" Margot stepped out from behind a fallen pillar, the document folder still clutched in her hands. "Hello, Father." The reunion was nothing like Morrison had expected. No tears, no recriminations, no dramatic confrontations. Klaus Richter looked at his daughter with the same cold appraisal he might have given a piece of military equipment. "You have disappointed me, Margot," he said quietly, "but perhaps it is not too late to correct your mistakes." "The only mistake I made was not killing you 3 years ago," Margot replied, her voice steady as stone. Richter smiled, and Morrison felt his blood chill. It was the smile of a man who'd learned to find amusement in other people's pain. "You always were too sentimental. It was your mother's influence, I suppose." Richter gestured to his soldiers, who immediately trained their weapons on Morrison and his men. "Gentlemen, please surrender your arms. This conversation does not concern you. Everything about this concerns us." Morrison replied, keeping his Thompson trained on Richter. "Those documents represent the property of murdered families. They're not yours to trade." "Murdered families?" Richter laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Sergeant, you misunderstand the nature of war. Those families were enemies of the Reich. Their property was legitimately confiscated according to German law." "German law?" Morrison felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. "You mean Nazi law? The law that said human beings could be murdered for their race and religion?" "I mean the law of survival," Richter replied calmly. "The strong take from the weak. The victorious claim the spoils. It has been this way since the beginning of time." Outside, the battle between American and German forces was intensifying. Automatic weapons chattered, grenades exploded, and men screamed as they died, fighting over principles and loyalties that seemed increasingly meaningless in the face of Richter's cold pragmatism. Chapter 10. Father and Daughter. "Give me the documents, Margot," Richter said, extending his hand. "Your little rebellion has gone on long enough." Margot looked at the folder in her hands, then at her father, then at Morrison. "These documents contain the names of 17 American officials who took German bribes, including Colonel Mitchell. They contain Swiss bank account numbers with over $400 million in stolen assets. They contain evidence that could destroy governments and start wars. Precisely why they are so valuable," Richter agreed. "With those documents, I can rebuild everything the Allies think they have destroyed. New Reich, new empire, new world order." "Over my dead body," Margot replied, and threw the documents into the burning remains of what had once been the monastery's altar. The effect was immediate and electric. Richter screamed, actually screamed, and lunged forward, but Morrison's Thompson was already chattering, cutting down 2 of the SS soldiers before they could react. The chapel ruins exploded into gunfire as Morrison's team engaged Richter's soldiers at point-blank range. Collins took a bullet in the shoulder but kept firing. Margot had pulled a pistol from somewhere and was shooting at her own father with methodical precision. "Rodriguez, Patterson, we need extraction now!" Morrison shouted into his radio while ducking behind a stone column as bullets chipped ancient limestone around his head. "Negative, Sarge. We're pinned down by American mortars. The whole area is hot." Morrison saw Klaus Richter diving toward the burning documents, trying to salvage what he could from the flames. The SS officer's perfect uniform was torn and bloody now, his silver hair singed, but his eyes still burned with fanatic determination. "You have destroyed everything!" Richter snarled at his daughter, pulling papers from the fire even as they burned his hands. 20 years of planning, 20 years of preparation." "Good," Margot replied, and put 3 bullets in her father's chest. Klaus Richter staggered backward, looking down at the spreading red stains with something like surprise. He opened his mouth to speak, but only blood came out. He fell to his knees among the burning documents, reaching for papers that crumbled to ash at his touch. "The Reich," he whispered, and toppled forward into the flames. Morrison stared at the scene, the burning documents, the dead SS officer, the daughter who had just killed her own father to prevent a greater evil. It should have felt like victory, but all Morrison felt was a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. "Is it over?" Collins asked, clutching his wounded shoulder. Before Morrison could answer, the monastery's main wall exploded inward as an American tank smashed through the ancient stones. The massive vehicle rolled into the chapel ruins with its main gun trained directly at Morrison's position. Colonel Mitchell's voice boomed from the tank's external speaker. "Sergeant Morrison, you are under arrest for treason, murder, and destruction of military property. Surrender immediately or face the consequences." Morrison looked around at his situation. Collins wounded, Rodriguez and Patterson still trapped in the bell tower under mortar fire, Margot staring at her father's corpse with tears streaming down her face, and an American tank with enough firepower to turn the entire monastery into powder. "Margot," Morrison said quietly, "please tell me you have one more trick up your sleeve." She looked up from her father's body, and Morrison saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. a kind of terrible peace. "I do have one more secret, Thomas," she said, using his first name for the first time. "The documents we just burned, they were copies." Morrison stared at her. "Copies? The real documents are hidden in a Swiss bank vault in Geneva, along with detailed testimony about every collaboration, every bribe, every betrayal documented in those files." Margot smiled through her tears. "Including complete records of Colonel Mitchell's transactions with my father." The tank's main gun swiveled toward them, and Morrison could see Mitchell in the commander's hatch, his face twisted with rage and fear. "You're telling me that Mitchell's crimes are documented in Switzerland?" Morrison asked. "Along with everyone else's. My father was many things, but he was not careless. He kept insurance policies." Morrison keyed his radio one more time. "Colonel Mitchell, this is Sergeant Morrison. I have something you need to hear." Mitchell's voice crackled back, filled with fury. "The only thing I need to hear is your surrender." "I need to hear about your Swiss bank accounts," Morrison replied calmly. "I need to hear about the $2 million you took from Klaus Richter between 1943 and 1944. I need to hear about your collaboration with the SS." The silence that followed was longer than it should have been, long enough for Morrison to know that his shot in the dark had hit its target. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mitchell finally replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Geneva Bank and Trust, account number 447291, Margot called out, loud enough for the tank's external microphones to pick up. $2.3 million deposited in monthly installments since January 1943. The tank's gun barrel wavered slightly, and Morrison could see Mitchell talking urgently to someone inside the vehicle. "Here's the deal, Colonel," Morrison continued. "You let us walk out of here and those Swiss records stay in Switzerland. You try to kill us, and copies get mailed to every newspaper from here to Washington. You're bluffing." "Try me," Morrison replied. "Ask yourself, is it worth the risk? Is whatever you're hiding worth spending the rest of your life in a military prison?" The standoff stretched out like a held breath. Around them, the battle between American and German forces was winding down as both sides realized their primary targets were either dead or beyond their reach. The dawn light streaming through the ruined monastery walls illuminated a scene of destruction that looked like the end of the world. Finally, Mitchell's voice came through the radio one last time. "You have 30 minutes to clear the area. After that, this entire monastery becomes a free fire zone." The tank's engine roared to life, and the massive vehicle backed out through the hole it had made in the monastery wall. Morrison slumped against a stone pillar, feeling 3 months of tension drain out of him like water from a broken dam. "Rodriguez, Patterson, the area's clear. Come on down." His 2 soldiers emerged from the bell tower, moving carefully through the rubble-strewn monastery grounds. Rodriguez had a cut on his forehead, and Patterson looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last hour, but both were alive and functional. "Is it really over, Sarge?" Patterson asked, staring at Klaus Richter's corpse. Morrison looked around at the destroyed monastery, at the bodies of German and American soldiers scattered among the ancient stones, at Margot kneeling beside her father's body with tears in her eyes. "The shooting's over," Morrison replied. "Whether it's really over, I guess we'll find out." Chapter 11. Aftermath and Reckoning. They left the monastery of Saint-Adelin as the sun reached its zenith. 4 American soldiers and 1 French resistance fighter walking through the Belgian countryside like refugees from a war that had consumed everything they'd once believed in. Colin's shoulder wound had been bandaged, but he needed proper medical attention. Rodriguez and Patterson carried extra ammunition and supplies they'd scavenged from the battlefield. Margot carried nothing but the clothes on her back and the weight of having killed her own father. "Where do we go now?" Collins asked as they crested a hill that gave them a view of the surrounding landscape. Smoke rose from a dozen points on the horizon. The monastery battle had triggered fighting all along the front lines. Morrison studied their options. To the south lay American-controlled territory, but Colonel Mitchell's influence extended throughout the command structure. To the north lay German lines, where they would be shot as enemy combatants. To the east and west, more of the same, a war zone with no safe haven for soldiers who'd seen too much and knew too much. Switzerland, Margot said quietly. It is neutral, and I have contacts there, people who can help us disappear until this war ends. What about the bank records, the evidence against Mitchell and the others? Margot's smile was sad but determined. That evidence will surface when the time is right. After the war, when the world is ready to confront the truth about what happened here. Morrison nodded, understanding the implicit promise. Justice delayed, but not justice denied. They walked in silence for several kilometers, each lost in their own thoughts. Morrison found himself thinking about Omaha Beach again, but this time the memories didn't carry the same weight of guilt and horror. He'd started this war as a simple soldier, following orders. He was ending it as a man who'd learned that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought on official battlefields. "Tank," Rodriguez said, as they paused to rest beside a stream that ran clear and cold from the Belgian hills. "What are you going to tell them when they ask about Blackwood, about the treasure, about everything that happened?" Morrison considered the question while he refilled his canteen. "I'm going to tell them that Major Blackwood died in combat with German forces while attempting to secure enemy assets. I'm going to tell them that we followed orders and did our duty. And the rest of it never happened," Morrison replied firmly. "As far as the official record is concerned, we spent 3 days on routine patrol, encountered enemy resistance, and returned to base with nothing to report." Patterson looked uncertain. "But what about the truth, Sarge? Don't people deserve to know what really happened?" Morrison looked at the young soldier, barely 18, still believing in simple answers to complex questions. "Patterson, I've learned something in the last 3 months. Sometimes the truth is more dangerous than lies. Sometimes keeping quiet is the most patriotic thing you can do. But all that money, all those lives, will be remembered by the people who matter," Margot interrupted. "The families whose belongings were stolen, the children who survived the camps, the historians who will piece together the real story decades from now. The truth has a way of surfacing, even when powerful men try to bury it." They reached the Swiss border 3 days later, crossing at a remote mountain pass where Margot's resistance contacts had arranged for safe passage. Morrison's last view of the war zone was a column of smoke rising from what might have been St. Vith, where other soldiers were still fighting battles over territory that would be forgotten in 50 years. The Swiss authorities processed them efficiently and without too many questions. Margot disappeared into a network of contacts and safe houses that Morrison suspected extended far beyond Switzerland. Before she left, she pressed a small envelope into Morrison's hands. "What is it?" he asked. "Insurance," she replied. "If Colonel Mitchell or anyone else ever comes looking for you, mail that envelope to the address written inside. It contains enough evidence to destroy careers and governments. And if they don't come looking, then burn it and forget we ever met." Margot smiled, and for the first time since Morrison had known her, she looked genuinely happy. "Thomas, you have done something remarkable. You have chosen justice over duty, truth over convenience. History may never record your name, but the world is better because of what you did." She kissed him once, quickly, and disappeared into the Swiss crowd like smoke from a dying fire. Morrison and his men spent 2 weeks in Swiss internment camps, telling their carefully rehearsed story to intelligence officers who seemed more interested in processing paperwork than uncovering inconvenient truths. When they were finally repatriated to American forces, Morrison found himself facing a surprisingly friendly reception. Colonel Mitchell had been transferred to a desk job in Washington, officially for health reasons. The inquiry into Major Blackwood's death had been closed due to insufficient evidence and wartime exigencies. The missing German treasure was listed as unrecovered enemy assets, presumed destroyed. Morrison was promoted to Master Sergeant and awarded the Bronze Star for exceptional service in combat operations. Collins received a Purple Heart for his shoulder wound. Rodriguez and Patterson got commendations for valor under fire. None of them ever spoke publicly